William and Charlotte prove that the bond between a father and daughter is the sweetest. Every time she's around, we see a gentler side of William, even at the most formal military event.
It happened last night during what should have been an ordinary bedtime routine at Adelaide Cottage. Princess Charlotte, only 9 years old but far more perceptive than she is often given credit for, asked her father a question so direct and emotionally devastating that William had to leave the room before she could see him break. What she asked, and why it matters, reveals a family crisis the palace has been desperately trying to keep hidden. William had been reading to Charlotte from a book she had chosen earlier that evening, a familiar story about adventure and friendship that would normally hold her complete attention. That night, however, she had been unusually quiet, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. William noticed but continued reading, hoping the comfort of routine would ease whatever was troubling her. When he finished the chapter and closed the book, Charlotte did not ask for another page as she usually did. Instead, she looked at him with a seriousness far beyond her years and quietly said, "Papa, is Mommy going to die?" The question struck William like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and shattering the composure he had so carefully maintained, something he had not experienced since his own mother's death. He tried to respond, to offer the reassurance a parent is meant to give, but the words would not come. He did not know if everything would be fine, and in that moment, even a comforting lie felt impossible. Charlotte watched her father's face, and in his silence she found the answer he could not bring himself to say. William reached for her and pulled her into an embrace that was as much for his own comfort as it was for hers, holding her while she cried against his shoulder as months of fear, medical uncertainty, and carefully maintained public composure finally overwhelmed him. When Charlotte's sobs subsided enough for her to speak again, she asked the question that broke him completely. "Why won't anyone tell me the truth, and don't you trust me enough to know what's really going on?" It was that question about trust that shattered what remained of William's composure. He and Catherine had chosen together to shield their children from the full reality of her illness, believing silence would preserve normalcy for as long as possible. But Charlotte's words exposed the flaw in that decision. Children sense when something is wrong. They feel the tension, notice the changes, and piece together fragments of overheard conversations. Silence does not protect them, it only forces them to face their fears alone. William told Charlotte that her mother was very sick, sicker than they had let on, but that she was receiving the best possible care and that the family remained hopeful. He could not promise Catherine would be okay, because he did not have that certainty himself, and Charlotte, perceptive beyond her years, understood what he could not say. "I don't want to lose her," she whispered, adding that she did not want what happened to him to happen to her, referring to Diana and the loss William endured at 15. Hearing his daughter draw that parallel tore at his heart, and he stayed with her long after she should have been asleep, holding her hand and searching for words that could comfort without offering false hope. When he finally left her room sometime after 10 o'clock, he went to the bathroom and allowed himself to completely break down, something he rarely permitted even in private. Catherine found him there 20 minutes later, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, tears streaming down his face. The question was the one William and Catherine had both been dreading, the one they had tried to avoid by maintaining careful optimism and limiting what their children saw of Catherine's worst days. Yet at 9 years old, Charlotte was already old enough to see through parental performance and ask for the truth they had been withholding. Catherine sat down beside William on the bathroom floor, and they held each other as they faced the reality that they could no longer shield their children from what their family was enduring. The conversation that followed, stretching well past midnight, forced them to confront what they had been avoiding. William told Catherine about Charlotte's question about trust and her feeling of being excluded from the truth of her family's life, and Catherine immediately broke down in tears at the thought that her daughter felt shut out and frightened because no one had been honest with her. They had believed they were protecting Charlotte's innocence, allowing her to remain a little girl for as long as possible. But her question made it painfully clear that innocence had already been replaced by fear and uncertainty, feelings that might have been easier to bear if they had been accompanied by truth instead of silence. Charlotte's question had not come out of nowhere. It was the result of months of careful observation by a child unusually skilled at reading people and situations. Growing up royal meant living under constant scrutiny, and Charlotte had developed a heightened awareness that made her acutely sensitive to changes within her own family. She had noticed as early as August when Catherine canceled attending a friend's birthday party, followed by the growing number of doctor's appointments appearing on the family calendar. First monthly, then twice a month, then weekly, marked only as medical. Although her parents tried to schedule them during school hours, Charlotte would sometimes return home to find her mother pale and exhausted, insisting she had simply been resting. She also observed changes in her father, who had always been affectionate with Catherine but now touched her more gently, as if she might break. At night, lying awake in her bedroom directly above her parents' room at Adelaide Cottage, Charlotte overheard fragments of hushed conversations through the thin floor's never-full sentences, just words and phrases that were confusing and frightening. Each small detail added to her growing awareness that something was deeply wrong, even if no one would say it aloud. One night, when Charlotte got up to use the bathroom, she heard her parents talking in their bedroom below. Her mother was crying something Charlotte had rarely witnessed, while her father spoke in the low, steady tone he used to comfort others. Around the same time, Charlotte began to notice subtle but troubling changes at school. Teachers who had once been warmly professional became noticeably gentler and more forgiving, especially during moments of emotion. One afternoon, when Charlotte became frustrated with a difficult math problem and started to cry, her teacher hugged her and said, "It's okay, sweetheart. You're going through a lot right now." Charlotte knew she wasn't going through anything the teacher should have known about, which meant the adults knew something about her family that she did not. She also noticed that in recent family photos, her mother appeared thinner, her face more drawn despite careful makeup and lighting, and during a family visit in October, Charlotte saw her grandmother Carol watching Catherine with barely hidden worry. The tipping point came the previous week when Charlotte passed her parents' study and overheard her father speaking on the phone. His voice strained as he asked questions about treatment protocols and survival rates. Those two words, survival rates, lodged in Charlotte's mind, repeating endlessly, because people only talked about survival when someone might not survive. Suddenly, all the fragments she had been collecting for months fell into place. That night at dinner, Charlotte watched her mother closely and realized she was performing, acting cheerful and engaged while clearly exhausted, barely eating as she pushed food around her plate and asked about the children's day. William noticed too, his attention fixed on Catherine, ready to step in if she faltered. In that moment, Charlotte understood that her parents had been maintaining a facade of normality for months while something frightening unfolded behind the scenes. The question she asked her father that night was the result of all those observations, overheard conversations, and shifts in family dynamics that no 9-year-old should have to decipher alone. She needed to know whether the fear that had been growing inside her was real. The truth William and Catherine had tried so desperately to shield their children from the medical reality Catherine had been living with was far more serious than even the carefully managed public statements suggested. The cancer diagnosis in January had only been the beginning, followed by a grueling journey of complications, uncertainty, and the relentless fear that comes with fighting a life-threatening illness. Cancer, as Catherine had learned, respects neither titles nor privilege. The initial round of chemotherapy completed in the spring had been brutally difficult but showed encouraging results, and scans in June suggested the treatment was working. However, follow-up scans in August revealed concerning developments, not a clear recurrence, but persistent abnormalities indicating the cancer had not been fully resolved and might be more aggressive than first believed. Additional testing in September confirmed the oncologist's fears. The cancer had characteristics that made it resistant to standard treatments, and while the initial chemotherapy had been partially effective, it had not eliminated the threat. More aggressive treatment was needed, potentially including experimental therapies with significant risks and uncertain outcomes. Weeks were spent consulting multiple specialists, some urging immediate intervention while others advised cautious monitoring and adjusted treatment if the condition worsened. Throughout this period, William and Catherine maintained a careful facade for their children, scheduling Catherine's worst days during school hours and ensuring she rested before they returned home so she could manage a few hours of normal family life. On days when she was too unwell, William handled bedtime routines, explaining her absence as a need for extra rest or work, but the strain of this performance weighed heavily on them both. William carried the dual burden of his own fear of losing his wife and the constant vigilance required to keep the children from seeing how serious the situation truly was, while Catherine fought not only her illness but also to preserve a sense of normalcy for George, Charlotte, and Louis, often pushing her body beyond its limits because admitting the truth felt like admitting defeat. 4 months, and especially after Charlotte's question the night before, their conversations centered on when and how to tell the children the truth. Catherine's instinct was to protect them for as long as possible, sparing them the knowledge that their mother might die, while William increasingly believed the children were already carrying that fear without the information or support needed to process it. Catherine knew from her own upbringing that children could handle more truth than adults often allowed, yet witnessing the lifelong impact of Diana's death on William left her terrified of inflicting similar trauma on their own children. She feared that telling them and then recovering might leave them anxious for the rest of their lives, but remaining silent if something went wrong would feel like an unforgivable betrayal. Though doctors advised age-appropriate honesty, Catherine's greatest fear went beyond the illness itself. It was the possibility of leaving her children behind, of missing their lives and becoming a memory rather than a presence. William remained her anchor, even as she saw the toll the ordeal was taking on him, his terror at losing her, his fear of raising 3 children alone, and his anger, rare but powerful, at the injustice of a disease he could not fix despite all his privilege and power. The decision they made after Charlotte's question finally broke through the silence marked a turning point they could no longer avoid. What finally broke through their careful avoidance was the realization that truth, however painful, was less cruel than uncertainty. They agreed the children would be told what was happening in language each of them could understand. George would be given the most complete picture, Charlotte would receive honest answers to her questions without unnecessary or frightening detail, and Louis would be told that his mother was very sick, that doctors were helping her, and that everyone hoped she would get better, while acknowledging that no one could make promises. It would be the hardest conversation Catherine had ever faced as a mother, more difficult than explaining death after losing a beloved pet or discussing the pressures of royal life and why their family could not live like others. Charlotte's question had made it painfully clear that secrecy was causing more harm than honesty, because the children were already afraid and filling the silence with their own worst-case imaginings. As Catherine prepared herself for the family meeting William had scheduled for that morning, she thought carefully about how each child would receive the truth, knowing they were processing the situation in very different ways. George, in particular, had sensed something was seriously wrong since early summer, when he had walked into his father's study unannounced and found William on the phone, pale and tense, discussing medical details with someone George immediately recognized as a doctor. Although William ended the call quickly and insisted everything was fine, George, nearly 12, was old enough to recognize the lie. Unlike Charlotte, who absorbed her fear through observation and questioning, George had withdrawn into quiet, preemptive emotional preparation. He had searched cancer survival rates online, struggled through medical terminology, and read about treatment protocols and side effects, even researching historical accounts of queens and princesses who had died young, bracing himself for a possibility he could not voice aloud. As the future king, George already understood that his life would be shaped by duty and responsibility in ways other children's were not, but he had always assumed his mother would be there to guide him through that burden, a certainty now shaken at its core. George had always assumed that Catherine would be the steady presence guiding him through the daunting journey that lay ahead, helping him navigate the impossible demands of royal life while still seeing him simply as her son. The possibility of losing her represented not only a devastating personal loss but also a profound disruption to his future, forcing him to imagine facing his responsibilities without the one person who truly understood both the weight of the crown and the boy beneath it. In response, George had taken on a protective role toward his younger siblings that went far beyond typical eldest child behavior, carefully managing his emotions so as not to alarm them. This performance, however, left him exhausted and isolated, with no one to confide in, because acknowledging his fears would mean admitting the very reality he was trying to shield his siblings from. Several times over the past months, George had nearly asked his parents directly about his mother's condition, but each time he stopped himself, afraid that voicing the fear would somehow make it more real or make the situation worse. He told himself that if his parents believed he didn't know, they would tell him when they were ready, yet their continued silence became its own answer, suggesting the truth was too frightening to share even with their eldest child and future king. While George's isolation was deep and heavy, Louis processed the family's unspoken crisis very differently, with the confusion of a 6-year-old who sensed something was wrong but could not understand what or why. He noticed that his mother was often tired, that she sometimes winced in pain, and that his father watched her constantly with worried eyes. Like many children his age, Louis was highly attuned to emotional shifts, even if he lacked the words to describe them, and he sensed that something serious was troubling his parents, that George had grown more serious, and that Charlotte had become more clingy. He felt the disruption of familiar family rhythms through medical appointments, whispered conversations, and days when his mother stayed in bed while insisting she was simply tired. Lacking an explanation he could grasp, Louis filled in the gaps with his own imagined reasons, as children often do, and began acting out in small ways, testing boundaries and seeking attention because any attention felt better than the emotional distance he perceived. Teachers had mentioned to Catherine that Louis seemed more unsettled at school, struggling to focus and occasionally behaving aggressively in ways that were out of character, changes Catherine initially attributed to normal development but which now seemed to reflect the fear and confusion he could not yet express in words. The different ways George, Charlotte, and Louis responded to their family's crisis reflected not only their ages but also their personalities and roles within the family, yet all three were carrying the weight of uncertainty in their own silent ways, and their own different ways. All three children had been silently crying out for the truth their parents had been withholding. William and Catherine, in trying to protect them, had unintentionally created a situation in which each child suffered alone, George feeling he had to be strong for his siblings, Charlotte feeling excluded from a truth she had already sensed, and Louis feeling confused by changes no one would explain. Each of them carried a weight their parents had never meant them to bear, a burden that grew heavier with every week of continued silence. That was why William called a family meeting that morning, scheduled deliberately for 8:30, after breakfast but before the school day routine could begin. William and Catherine sat together on a sofa in the living room at Adelaide Cottage, positioned so they could see all three children seated across from them. George's expression was guarded and anxious, Louis's showed puzzled curiosity, and Charlotte sat between her brothers, holding both their hands as if bracing them for what was to come. Catherine spoke first, her voice steady despite the fear William could see in her eyes, telling them they needed to talk about something important, something they should have addressed sooner. She explained that she had been very sick for nearly a year, that although she had undergone surgery and treatment, she was still ill and the doctors were continuing to help her get better. Louis immediately asked, with 6-year-old directness, whether she was going to die, the same question Charlotte had asked but delivered with simple curiosity rather than dread. Catherine's voice wavered, but she answered honestly, saying she hoped not, that she was receiving excellent care and the doctors were doing everything they could, but that she was sick enough that she and Papa could not promise she would definitely recover, and that this uncertainty was frightening for everyone. The truth was painful but necessary, and William watched his children's faces as they absorbed her words. George then asked the next question, revealing just how much he had already pieced together on his own, quietly admitting that he believed it was cancer because he had looked it up online and recognized the symptoms, an admission that hit William with a rush of emotion as he realized his 11-year-old son had been researching his mother's illness alone instead of feeling able to ask for help. Catherine confirmed what George had already suspected, telling them gently but directly that she had cancer, that it had been discovered at the beginning of the year, and that while the initial treatment had helped significantly, the illness had returned and now required a different approach that might be more effective. She simplified the medical details without avoiding the truth, honoring George's maturity and his clear need for real information. Charlotte then asked a quieter, more personal question, wondering if this was why her mother had been so tired and unable to do the things she used to do with them. There was pain in her voice, but also relief, as if having her observations confirmed validated feelings she had long been unsure she was allowed to trust. Catherine answered simply that it was, and William stepped in to give her a moment to collect herself, admitting to the children that he and their mother had made a mistake. They had believed silence would protect them, he said, but instead it had forced them to face their fears alone, something families should never do. At that point George's composure finally broke as he confessed how frightened he had been, how he had known something was wrong but had no one to talk to, and how he kept thinking about what happened when William lost his own mother, terrified of the same fate for their family. As George cried openly, William moved beside him and held him, his own tears falling as well. Charlotte then asked the question William had most dreaded: what would happen if the treatment did not work, and Catherine, her voice trembling but resolute, answered that there would be very hard times, but that she would love them always, that William would take care of them, that they would take care of one another, and that everyone who loved them would help ensure they were safe. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, with the children asking questions and William and Catherine responding with honesty that was sometimes painful but always shaped to what each child could handle. By the time it ended, all 5 of them had cried, held one another, and faced together what each had previously endured alone. William felt utterly exhausted yet unexpectedly lighter, as if the weight of secrecy had been heavier than he had realized, while Catherine, though drained, felt relief in knowing her children no longer had to imagine fears worse than the truth. Before they finished, William set clear ground rules for the future. The children could ask anything at any time and would receive honest answers. They would be included in Catherine's care in small, appropriate ways. They would talk openly about their feelings, even the frightening ones. And above all, they would face whatever came next together, without secrets. As the children left to prepare for school late, but going anyway to preserve routine, William and Catherine remained alone in the quiet living room, acknowledging softly that they should have had this conversation months earlier and recognizing that it was Charlotte who had pushed them to do what they had always known was right but had been too afraid to face. The extraordinary circumstances of their birth had once seemed to justify shielding George, Charlotte, and Louis from harsh realities. But the children had shown that royal status did not exempt them from ordinary human needs. They still required honesty, emotional support, and the ability to process fear. Once William and Catherine decided to be truthful with their children, the palace communications team faced a new challenge. Traditionally, anything involving the direct heirs would remain strictly private, but the morning's family meeting changed the household's dynamic fundamentally. After consulting with senior advisors, William and Catherine issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging that the children had been told about Catherine's ongoing health challenges and requesting privacy as the family navigated this difficult period. The statement avoided medical details and sensationalism, yet recognized reality in a way that shielded the children from potential confusion or dishonesty in public discussions. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media overflowed with support, as people praised the family for prioritizing their children's emotional well-being, while child development experts questioned why the children had been kept in the dark for so long, highlighting the months of anxiety the silence had caused. The broader implication for the palace was whether this experience might reshape how royal children are raised and protected. Queen Elizabeth's approach had emphasized strict separation between public duty and private pain, training her descendants to mask vulnerability, which provided institutional stability but exacted a heavy personal toll. For George, Charlotte, and Louis, the long-term impact would depend on the progression of Catherine's illness. If her treatment succeeded, the children would carry a story of resilience, family unity, and the value of honest communication. If not, they would face profound loss. George as heir without his mother's guidance, Charlotte losing the parent who understood her sensitivity, and Louis left with fragmented memories of a mother he was too young to fully know. William would face the daunting responsibility of raising 3 grieving children while managing his own grief and preparing for kingship. The palace recognized that either outcome would require careful long-term support, and arrangements were quietly being made for child psychologists to work with all 3 children. Ultimately, Charlotte's question had forced the adults in her life to understand that protection and honesty were not mutually exclusive. Children require age-appropriate truth about serious family matters, coupled with boundaries around details they are not ready to process. As the family embraced this balance, William and Catherine noticed positive changes. Freed from the weight of secrets and unspoken fear, the children were coping far better. George slept through the night without imagining worst-case scenarios, Charlotte became more confident and less clingy, and Louis's behavior normalized once he understood that family tension was not his fault. The conversation Charlotte had instigated had been one of William's most challenging parenting moments, but it had proven necessary. In confronting fear together, the family discovered strength, resilience, and the power of honesty. Holding Charlotte that night, witnessing his family finally share the burdens they had carried alone, William understood deeply that painful truth, given with love and care, was the greatest gift he could offer his children as they faced whatever lay ahead.